Then we'll get started. Um, thank you very much for your patience. Okay. Okay. So good morning, everybody. I'm Susan Aronson, Director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and today's webinar is going to focus on competition policy. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Elon Strauss, who will moderate this, as he is much more an expert on um, competition policy than I am. Dr. Strauss is co-director of the AI Disclosures Project. He's also a senior research associate at University College London. And so I'll let him take it from here.
Thanks so much, Susan. We have a very exciting talk for you today, and our two distinguished guests I'll be introducing are Asad Ramanzali and KJ Bakchi. Asad is Director of Artificial Intelligence and Technology Policy at the Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. Asad notably served as the Chief of Staff and the Deputy Director for Strategy at the Biden-Harris White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the OSTP, with the designation of Special Assistant to the President. And then prior to OSTP, he worked on Capitol Hill for 4 years, among other things. And then our second speaker, KJ Bakchi, is currently Vice President, U.S. Policy and Government Relations at the Chamber of Commerce. KJ also served as the Vice President of Technology Policy at the Chamber of Progress previously. And he was Senior Policy Counsel at New America's Open Technology Institute. And I can't wait to hear what our two distinguished guests have to say on this topic. Asad, you have a slide, so maybe do you want to start us off, given that you have that slide to share with us?
Yeah, more than happy to. And thank you all for doing this. Let me share my screen. Is it visible here?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So Susan had reached out because I wrote an op-ed in Time Magazine not that long ago about concentration we're starting to see in the AI world. And I thought I'd just do a very, very simple breakdown of what that looks like here. And then I'll spend a minute on what some of the issues are that this leads to allow for more conversation. So a lot of people think about AI, the supply chain of AI, as a technical stack with applications, the things that you interact with, being on the top. Those are enabled by foundation models, which are built, sometimes that's called trained, and accessed, which people call inference, in cloud computing data centers that are full of chips. So super simplistic, and this doesn't capture everything, but these are the four layers of the stack. In my mind, what we want is innovation at the layer of the applications. That's what is going to lead to business productivity. That's what people interact with. That's where the promise lies. And everything else enables that in some way or another. So when I think about what's going on below that, that's where, to me, competition policy and looking at the concentration rates and what kinds of anti-competitive behavior start to emerge is important. So I've listed some of the numbers here. They get pretty staggering the deeper you go into the stack. At the very bottom layer, lithography is the tools you need to create chip semiconductor manufacturing. ASML has 100% of that in one type of lithography. TSMC is where all the advanced chips, or not all, 70% of the AI chips are manufactured. They're based in Taiwan. NVIDIA has huge shares of the AI chips market, and they've now got the largest market share of any largest market capitalization of any company in the world. And so it goes on and on. At the cloud layer, three companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, have 2/3 of the revenue. And you also start to see that among foundation model providers. The thing I want to say here is two things are emerging that are useful to note. One, within the interactions between the layers, you're starting to see vertical integration. So if you play with ChatGPT, that's really an application, ChatGPT, based on OpenAI's own models, like GPT-4 or 5. That may not seem insidious to you, but where it gets more complicated is Microsoft is also OpenAI's largest investor, and NVIDIA just announced that they're going to be investing in OpenAI as well. Where that gets problematic is when they have incentives to prefer their own companies throughout the stack rather than allowing the market to innovate and to try new things that might be competitive with some of those parts of the stack. So I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing so I can see you all and have the discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. KJ, do you want to offer your perspective?
Yeah, sure, happy to. I apologize for not having a slide to sort of layer on Assad's, but I do think it raises some compelling points. And I think before even jumping into all that, first off, thank you to Susan for bringing us together for this conversation and also for having diverse perspectives, because I think sometimes it is easy to be in a sort of echo chamber. So appreciate bringing the sort of industry perspective to this. And just at the top, like my background is I'm at the Chamber of Progress. We're a left-leaning trade tech industry association, meaning that we work on behalf of industry organizations focused on really engagement with the Democrats and other sort of progressive-leaning lawmakers. I want to start at the outset by saying that investment in this space is incredibly it's incredibly high, and it is the pacing continues on, right? I think Stanford put out a report saying that about $109.1 billion from private companies were put into this space. And I think what I would also put out at the outset is that there is real concern among policymakers about the American sort of industry being able to outcompete against China as a competitor in this space. And so that 109 billion from private industry is 12 times more than what we've seen from China, just looking again at 2024. I think when we talk about the AI stack and what Assad is pointing out, I think what I tend to sort of feel a little deja vu, because this seems like the conversation we had with industry and policymakers about competition on big tech, right? In 2022 and 2023, where a lot of these bills were coming out of Congress and the Biden administration's FTC and so on were really going after companies. And I think it's sort of the same playbook that I just don't think really applies to this emerging field for a few reasons. And one is I do think that again, the tendency to sort of say big is bad, that big investments, big profits, big investments means that there's something sort of insidious, to use Assad's term, is going on here, I think is just misleading when we actually look at this very big burgeoning field. I think, if you look at Wall Street, the tech industry has been kind of looked to as the Magnificent Seven. But, forecasters are saying that like even that investment is starting to change up. And you see companies like Oracle that has said that they're going to put in $1 billion over the next 5 years down the stack in investment. You see Salesforce and Palantir and other companies coming into play. New frontier models are emerging, every day, not every day, but like in quick succession after ChatGPT, we heard obviously from Anthropic, Google, and Meta, but there's Cohere, Alpha, Bloomberg GPT, Amazon has their Titan that they're trying to build on. So I would argue that, again, the competition is growing. It's an emerging field. And Stanford put out a report again talking about how with this development and fast like pace innovation that there's just cheaper entry. It is cheaper for folks to come and enter, right? Costs have declined by 30% annually, and the energy efficiency, which again is we want to see technology be more efficient in this space. We want to see data centers be more efficient about using energy. We all have that interest there. So cheaper entry as the field emerges. I think it's again a little early, as I keep saying, to sort of look at the field and say, look, here are the dominant players, here are the big gatekeepers, and to sort of use the same narrative that we've seen in the past. The other, I do have a few quick points on this. Again, the International Center for Law and Economics put out a paper talking about how using the sort of old models of identifying competition, the old metrics that we would use for focusing on the semiconductor industry, just simply don't really work here. You can't look at a sort of static industry and say, look, we're seeing market capitalization here and profits here. And that is, they cite sort of two laws, not to get super too wonky about this, but essentially the semiconductor industry has to they're held to the standard of two laws, like Rock's law and Moore's law. Moore's law essentially calls for continual investment every quarter in order to make sure that you're ahead of the curve. And if you lose that production or you lose that innovation, you lose market share, you lose the customer base. And Rock's Law continues to talk about, look, every single time you're building a new iteration of chip, you have to invest more into it. You're trying to pack more into these, into what you're fabricating. And so their argument is that, look, the ways we would sort of take a snapshot of a market and say, this is where the dominant players are, here's where market cap is, here's where investments are, and here's where profits are. Well, again, the way that things are developing, really, when we're seeing these investments, they really amount more to a just large bet. They're hoping that the industry will play out. The two things, the last few points I'll quickly make is when we talk about competition, I'm always, as a policy, as an attorney who plays in the policy space, I'm always curious about what is the remedy that we're talking about. So we're seeing this emerging field that I think we can argue is still not like we're not sort of solid, frozen solid. So what is the remedy that like we're thinking about if we see competition? The second thing is, look, a lot of our consumer protection laws, including antitrust laws and so on, really focused on consumer harm. And so again, I would argue that there are a multitude of choices for consumers in the US when looking at foundation models and applications, being super niche into what they want to build. We at Chamber of Progress have built our own sort of GPT system to help us just look at past state testimony, and we train the model to be able to quickly like kind of give us bullet points on new legislation that we see to compare it against old legislation to see if there's any sort of comparative points there. And the last sort of point I'll make is, again, when we're talking about harms, I think we can definitely look at private industry and say, look, this is concerning that the big players who have the capital are investing in this, and we're concerned about capturing the market there. And I think Assad is right to say, look, we should be paying attention here. But I do think that there is a space for government to make incredible investment in this space, and that's why we've endorsed the Create AI Act. In Congress, has not moved, but the idea of what it's developing is essentially like open model sort of cloud computing and allowing researchers and other folks to have access to data to build their own models. And again, it just, I think if we want an equal footing from newer entrants beyond what we're already seeing come out there, I do think government has a massive place to play. But again, that's just me with my policy hat. And I covered quite a bit, so I wanted to turn it back over to Assad, or I guess to Alon, to continue the conversation.
That's fantastic. Thanks for laying out those issues. So you raised the question of how competitive, in fact, is the market? Are we seeing any harms? And, what are possible remedies? So you kind of covered a lot. So maybe we can just cover each of those three things one by one. I mean, Asad, do you just want to respond immediately to the idea, which is kind of maybe somewhat counter to your slide, that this market actually is very competitive, it's very dynamic, and because of that, the risks from a lack of competition, from too much concentration, are in fact, overblown potentially.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point that the market is still evolving and dynamic, and we're seeing shifts in, at least at the foundation model layer, we see shifts in who's leading the market, what's that look like, the revenue share of API revenue, for example, has shifted recently between Anthropic and OpenAI. That's all reasonable. I don't think that means there aren't competition problems, but let me try to break down. I don't start from the premise that big is necessarily bad, KJ. I think that's a fair concern that I have on other dimensions. But for the sake of competition policy, I think about there's not going to be some small competitor to ASML. There's not going to be a startup with two people in a garage that's going to build a new lithography machine. I know there are some startups trying, but it's a very capital intensive business. There are inherent barriers to entry. There's a lot of things that are complicated in that market. My view is here's the kinds of things that we're seeing today. So in the summer, vibe coding started to become really popular. Everybody was playing off of these AI coding agents. I myself was trying to build certain things, and it's been a number of years since I've built anything with code. So that was a fun little exercise. The couple of players that emerged were Cursor and Windsurf. And a lot of you, I'm guessing, heard about these names thrown around a little bit. Windsurf was emerging as the number two. They got pretty popular. So again, this is at the application layer. They were based largely on Anthropic's model. So they were based on a Claude API. There was reporting, the press reported that OpenAI was in discussion to buy Windsurf. As soon as that happened, Anthropic sent a letter to Windsurf that said we're going to cut you off from our API. You've got 4 days to transition off. That's the kind of unfair behavior. That's the kind of picking winners and losers that I worry about. Where vibe coding, very nascent market, it shows promise. There's real revenues. People were excited about it. There's some skepticism now, but people are still excited about it. People are using those tools. But for Anthropic to be able to say, just because you might be working with one of our competitors, we're going to cut off your API access and you have 4 days, that impacts all the businesses that were based on Windsurf. That impacts Windsurf as a startup. That's where I get worried. Now you see this up and down the stack. You see AWS, if you're a user of AWS, it's a lot easier to build on it's a lot easier to build on Anthropic because AWS has an investment in Anthropic. So there's a native integration into AWS's cloud. That happens with Microsoft Azure and OpenAI. That's complicated if you're a startup. It's not impossible to surmount. People are figuring that out, but it's complicated. So those kinds of dimensions of picking winners and losers is where I get worried.
Very interesting. And you kind of lay out that argument in greater detail in your Time magazine op-ed. So I recommend people kind of explore that. And that gets me thinking just about how difficult it is to ensure there is competition in the AI stack, precisely because of how expensive it is to train these models. And because of that, the only way to potentially recoup costs might be for a model developer like an OpenAI or Anthropic to then potentially integrate into other layers like applications, and potentially even cloud, right? OpenAI also wants to be a cloud provider, similar to Amazon, and Amazon is also integrating across the whole stack. So given how expensive it is to build the models, and then given how expensive it is to actually just serve, continuously user queries, when you ask a model a question, it's several times more expensive for the model to process that question and answer it than, let's say, a Google search when it tries to answer your query. So in economics, you call that very high marginal costs. Building the model means there's very high fixed costs. So naturally, this would lead to a concentrated market, would assume, just like other markets where it's very expensive to kind of build the infrastructure and then serve continuously the service. So given the economics of this market, I mean, can we really expect vibrant competition, many firms competing? And if we can't, then what really is the correct regulatory approach for kind of government or markets to take? So I'd love to hear both of your perspectives on this. I don't know who wants to start.
Maybe I'll kick it off and then KJ hand it to you. Does that work? So I think you're right that it is expensive to build models. The marginal cost, marginal revenue concepts and economics are skewed right now because none of these companies are profitable, at least at the foundation model layer, and mostly at the application layer, it seems. Where my read of what you just described, though, is this is not unique. This is something we've seen in banking, for example. This is something we've seen in telecommunications, for example. In the Time magazine piece, I talk about railroads. Railroads, extremely capital intensive. They went through a number of boom and bust cycles. They went through things that looked like bubbles. It distorted the market. All of those things happened. At the end of the day, railroads were a net, useful invention for society. I think AI has a lot of positive upsides. I'm not an anti-AI person, but where my mind goes is we're not trying to develop a market that looks like consumer goods at the foundation model layer. You're not going to have 1,000 model providers. But because of the reasons you just stated, it's really hard to get into there. There's a few firms who are going to compete. Competition's good. The places where you have an incentive to be anti-competitive or unfair, like who you create API access for or who you invest in, that's where the role of government to put the guardrails on anti-competitive behaviors, that's where my mind comes in. We have non-discrimination rules. We have neutrality rules. It is a more extreme measure. I think it's warranted to call for separation, maybe not this second between applications and models, maybe as the market matures more, but you could start to do that at the cloud layer. It does seem to me like there's an inherent conflict of interest when Microsoft invests in OpenAI or when AWS invests in Anthropic. Those are the kinds of things that I worry about.
Great, thanks.
I would add, I mean, I think I think we're on the same page, Asad and I, about the idea, the importance of a government investment in this. Again, I'll keep plugging the Create AI Act again, because it is expensive, as you pointed out, Elon, right, to kind of enter into this space. I think where I have a tough time is I sort of not waffle, but like I'm just not sure in terms of like if current regulations are enough to sort of to kind of enforce, fair competition in this space. Again, because I still, referring back to my initial points, I think the field is emerging. I think the fact that, in Assad's anecdote about what happened with Anthropic and OpenAI, the fact that you have two players in that story, like, in that fact, what broke down, you have competitors in this space that are going to be, undertaking ruthless practices. This idea of like winner to, picking winners and losers is again the same sort of narrative we heard when it came to talking about sort of like online like retail spaces and like what, and what the remedies were there were to like essentially break apart. So I don't know. I'm still unclear, I'll be honest, about whether I think the current regulations are enough, if we need to enhance guardrails in this new sort of emerging space or modernize them. I think again for me it's hard to move past the idea that like I think the field is still emerging up and down the stack. And I think even looking at just again the semiconductor industry where looking at Assad's first slide there, looking at like how much profits were made at that point, I'm like, yeah, that's right now, right? We know that there are disruptors in this space that come through. We know that DeepSeek, right, like came out into the market and kind of disrupted and kind of created this rush of investment and also showed people that we can have like, that DeepSeek was able to use like, a lesser quality of chip, right, more energy efficient, and was still able to like create some sort of like model here. So I don't have as clean of an answer as Assad here in terms of like what I think regulations could look like. I think there's the debate's going to have to be between like what do we currently have on the books? Is that enough? Versus, is there something that has to be modernized? But I think in general, it's hard for me to move past the idea that like I just don't think there is strict, like I haven't seen any examples of like this is a gatekeeper dominating the space.
Thank you. So you bring up DeepSeek, so I thought maybe now's a good time to discuss the global context within which US policy debates happen. And the global context necessarily will inject some competition, right, into the US market, because even if even if there's only two firms dominating models or cloud or applications in the US, they still face competition potentially on a global basis. And that's also used as an argument to say, well, we need to focus more on subsidizing potentially these companies or creating an environment in which they can compete even better on global markets, and trying to kind of look at any problems around concentration or any kind of guardrails which might hold them back on the global stage is therefore harmful to helping them compete globally. So the global context should be used to have, potentially fewer safeguards in America and fewer kind of antitrust and consumer protection policies. What would each of you say to kind of that argument?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So I would just say like directly, because I think this is sometimes the misidentification of an industry position. I don't think, at least from our Chamber of Progress, from my perspective, like the idea that like we should not have guardrails in order to innovate, I don't think is something is not a position we would take, right? I think that if we need to have let's also not pass legislation that hinders the ability to sort of innovate and to create, and to compete in this space and to let companies sort of grow and flourish. But again, being anti any sort of regulation at all in the name of like innovation and being globally competitive is not something we would agree with. I think the concern is real though, right? With the idea of the US, being winning the sort of like global race to AI. I think we saw with 5G, it's sort of been, I think it's kind of acknowledged now that the US sort of lost this, this race and in terms of like the ability to kind of innovate and build there. I do think that it's one of the few bipartisan issues we see in Congress, this idea that like investment in American companies to ensure that we're building chips and also that frankly that it is our technology that is being used as much as possible globally. I think the concern again focusing on whatever, again, like not delving too into the weeds on sort of foreign policy perspectives. But again, the idea of like if China becomes the world supplier of this tech or chips or whatever in this competitive space, it does raise other like conflicts we have when it comes to other, into when it delves into other sort of policy issues. So again, I would say for us, there's no concern about having like fair regulation, but again, it has to like not be something that's stifling.
Asad?
Yeah, I appreciate KJ saying that's not the position of his organization, that there shouldn't be, or that regulate fair regulation and innovation are at odds. And correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth. We have heard that perspective from industry. We have seen investors and others who pretty publicly say that it is at odds for any kind of regulation because that can get in the way of American national interests. The two thoughts I have there are, one, if you look at our chief adversary in this geopolitical race, that's China. China is not afraid to regulate the way that it wants to reflect its values. That's actually why I believe that in large part AI is a national security issue, because our values should matter in the development of this technology. And two, you can do two things at the same time. You can infuse industrial policy. You can use industrial policy to infuse capital into a market where we believe there's a national security imperative to have manufacturing in the US, for example, as we did with the CHIPS Act. And say that if you're going to get, especially in that case, if you're going to get money from the US government, you should have a non-discrimination policy where you can't pick you can't pick winners and losers among your customers. So I think you can actually do both of those two things at the same time. It's hard for me to imagine a scenario where a non-discrimination like rule, which basically would say you can't discriminate among your competitors to pick winners and losers, where that would actually skew innovation. And all of the incentives for the vertical integration that's happening today. So if you look at legal tech, you hear a lot about lawyers are starting to use it in ways that they get slapped on the wrist by courts sometimes because of the hallucinations. But you're starting to see real use cases in document review and a bunch of other things on the back end. Well, OpenAI Startup Fund is invested in a company called Harvey. If you're a legal tech company, would that give you a little bit of angst on actually using OpenAI and what the incentives are for OpenAI to help you versus that company? I'd have angst, right? So that's where it gets messy, and creating a rule structure of you can't discriminate based on your investments. You can't discriminate based on vertical integration, to me, is an easy starting point.
Thanks a lot. And yeah, I must say, I'm reminded of in Korea, the national champions there, the Chabal, and they also had a very complex web of investments in each other, in the banks, and the banks were invested in them. And then for a while, that facilitated growth. But now in Korea, they basically said that this tangled web of investments, similar to what we're seeing in America with AI, between, model developers investing in the application layer, like you mentioned with Harvey, the chip producers, or rather designers like NVIDIA investing in OpenAI, etc. So at some point, countries, especially in Asia, where that was the model of development, they started to regulate this entangled web of ownership and financing, which we're seeing in America today, which I find quite interesting. But I think we're going to open up for questions now. Thank you to both of you for really kind of laying out your positions with such clarity. So I really think we can kind of see the assumptions and the overlaps and differences so clearly. So thanks for that. And then, so Susan, we're going to open up to questions now, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see any in our Q&A, so I encourage you to put them in the Q&A. I'll ask one while we're waiting for those questions, which is, I think the failure to regulate has had some unanticipated spillovers, and one I would argue is digital sovereignty. And what I mean by that is efforts, for example, in the EU, Australia, and other countries to develop their own stack, if you will, of AI products and services. So I'm very worried about that because I think it is leading to things like less data sharing, which has implications for um, the efficacy of various types of AI, and also for the use of AI to solve wicked problems. So I'd like to hear the speaker's thoughts on that. And again, we encourage you put your questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I'd agree with your premise, Susan. I think that the failure to regulate has led to other countries wanting to create their own versions of their own tech stack. I was in Switzerland, I guess it was 2 months ago, and a lot of their policymakers have been talking about what does it look like to build the full stack within Switzerland itself. So not even EU, but just Swiss owned. And it's hard for me when I look at the kind of global stage to say that that's a good idea for the sake of innovation. If I was Switzerland with their history, with their kind of ethos of independence, I get that. I get the desire. And part of that is like, there's such a stranglehold among a few countries, among a few companies in America that have become really powerful. Where my mind goes is if you had more kind of fairness regimes, it becomes less the concerns are smaller from other countries to build their own stack if they feel like there's a fairness going on. Now, a lot of the sovereignty issues come from data governance, like intelligence issues and 702 and a bunch of other things that countries are worried about, and happy to get into those, but those feel like a different topic that I have concern about as well. But to me, and one thing KJ said of this feels like the same narrative as the kind of 2020 to 2023 era of big tech domination conversation that was happening. It's in part because it's the same companies, right? OpenAI's biggest investors are Microsoft and now Nvidia. Um, OpenAI's also invested in AMD, a chips designer. Anthropic's biggest investor is AWS and then Google. So these are all the same players. So the fact that we're seeing the same types of issues crop up, I don't think those issues went away. Policymakers didn't pass the legislation that was on the table. But if you talk to small businesses who are selling on Amazon, they're still as worried as they were 5 years ago, if not more.
Sure, and I think,
KJ?
yeah, I mean, so I have not worked on the issue of digital sovereignty, Susan, so I wouldn't be able to give you much there. I do think in terms of just our perspective on like smart regulation, what that could mean in this space. Again, I don't think we talked too much in the first half hour about like what is consumer harm or what is the concern about sort of consolidation with one company, or one sort of dominant player kind of owning one part of the stack. I do know that when it comes to at least the foundation, the kind of the model, the application side, the sort of the idea of data, right? Personal data being sort of consolidated has been something that has been brought up in context. I do think this is where the importance of pushing for a national framework, right, on data privacy is critical. And I think where we see Congress sort of failing, we see the states stepping in and kind of pushing their own sort of data privacy protections, which I think is, I think will make it complicated if we have a patchwork, as more states pass this law. We do see the same with AI kind of regulation again, with Congress sort of failing, states are stepping in, and now we're, with California having passed its sort of transparency AI law, that has become the kind of the baseline to build into to bring to other states. I do think, I mean, again, what Asad and I feel like we'll just go ping pong back and forth on this idea that, again, I think because it is the same players that are like investing, I think it is easy to point the same kind of like accusations or the concerns, right, from last time. But like, I think that again, the companies I named at the top, just responding to that point that Asad made, like, yeah, I do think some of the concerns are there. I think where we sort of started breaking down in regulation is like, well, what are the remedies here? And what are you actually going to, how are you going to actually solve for the issues that you're bringing up? And one of the issues we had with one of the competition bills, not going too much into that fight, but one of the proposals was essentially focusing on a non-discrimination provision for companies as it comes to like regulating their own platforms. And so our concern there was, well, that's fine if your native non-discrimination sounds good, but that also means that content that is potentially like harmful, violence inciting and all that, that's you're also keeping the door open for that. And we worked with the authors there to try to change that language that never went away. The other provisions that came up in the remedy space were breaking up companies. Well, then the conversation of what happens if you break up say, Google Maps and Google Search, what happens to the data that's being collected there? So I think it's important to talk about these conversations in the AI context, right? In the AI stack and talk through, let's like keep an eye out here, but also remedies are a critical part of the conversation. And that's why I'm saying, like, I'm not sure necessarily if the current laws are enough to kind of, we're seeing courts, we're seeing the DOJ, right, like bringing their lawsuits. We see states bringing lawsuits in the competition space at large, not necessarily in the AI context against, these big tech companies. But again, the remedies there are monetary. And like, I think overall, if we're concerned about real harm to consumers, how their data is used against them, how other countries may have access to that data, or what data sharing actually means. I think again, data governance it needs to be regulated at a core. And then I think that can at least give us some sort of safety net as we talk about applications of data in these different contexts.
Elon, did you want to add anything from an economist perspective?
Mm. Well, I will say that the main standard in kind of antitrust is still this consumer protection or the consumer welfare standard. And historically, consumers have gotten enormous welfare benefits from giving their data over to these big tech companies in exchange for free products. Um, uh, but that doesn't mean that harms cannot be prevented along the way. And some of those harms might, you got to weigh them against the benefits to consumers. And some of those harms might just be outright wrong or outright illegal, especially if they're, using and reselling consumer data in ways which go against the consumer's interests, violate existing laws. And so I do agree that we never really came to terms with certain harms that existed during the big tech era and how to kind of regulate these natural monopolies like a Google search, where it is integrated into the ad stack. And that in some ways subsidizes so much of the space. And we never came to terms with what does it mean to ensure that platforms are using data always in their consumers' interests and not against them. Just like in healthcare, it's illegal to kind of now deny people coverage based on their data because you're using their data kind of potentially against them. And banks, there's similar laws, with banks and how they use consumer data. So I agree, we need those protections for the AI space, especially because these companies are going to need to make money soon, and they're probably going to monetize user data heavily. And that data is now in the form of AI memories. And so coming to terms with how to kind of regulate data in the AI space will be vital, since the commercial interests are definitely kind of closing in. And I see there's a number of questions in the chat now.
Yes, yes. Okay, so thank you. Are there any national security issues between territories that are unique in the AI environment?
I'm happy to start with that one. So I think there are a few. I think about the national security concerns in a couple of different ways. One, I think that government use of a service, and when you see kind of proliferated use across business and critical infrastructure providers. So like at the cloud layer, you see almost ubiquity. There's not really that many websites that aren't hosted on, one of a couple of cloud providers. That dependence itself becomes a national security concern in a way that digital infrastructure, I think, is more readily, the markets are more readily designed to be able to do something like that, to be a dependency. So I don't think we're quite there yet on foundation models where like we have a dependency of use, but you could see that start to emerge. I think the core national security issues actually come down to how militaries use AI, which to me is actually pretty different than chatbots, even though the like AI conversation gets conflated. The kind of AI that we need for core defense purposes is different, even if the DoD is using chatbots for other purposes. So to me, those kinds of concerns get pretty real, and the need for that kind of AI is just different in my mind than the kind of chat GPT things we're talking about.
And since we're all among friends here, I'll take off my sort of Chamber of Progress hat and put on my Center for Civil Rights and Tech hat, the last organization I was at. I do think facial recognition technology and how that is utilized, how this sort of AI powered kind of like surveillance again, that's not about necessarily data being put in, but like comparing images to data sets, right, that are maybe publicly available, like driver's license, databases and so on. So I do think one context as it comes to when we think about some of our competitors, and again, I think Assad put it much more eloquently, thinking through like reflecting what their interests are and how they will use that technology in their own jurisdictions, I think is something that, outside of my just day job, like keeps me up at night if we're playing in this global space. And again, we've been talking a lot about China here, but I'm thinking about other countries, frankly, that like may, import this technology and it may not be used in a way we that let's sort of reflect what we call American values. And so that is, we can talk about data governance in the US, but I do think as we start opening up the borders, the idea of like how this technology can be used, um, is something, yeah, that is a real concern for sure.
I do need to add something to this particular question, which is that the governments of Australia and the Netherlands, in their national security risk reports, cited US and Chinese control over these sectors, if you will, in different ways, as a national security risk. So if anyone wants copies of those reports, I'm pleased to send them because I've written quite a bit about that. End of commercial. Okay, another question is both speakers seem to emphasize US China versus Chinese competition frameworks. Would they be able to speak on other jurisdictions, including the EU, and whether this will lead to convergence and divergence in the products and services available to different markets? How do other tools, including FTA provisions, impact convergence and divergence? That's a very different webinar, but
I'm far from an expert on these issues. The couple thoughts that come to mind for me are the reason that US China, the narrative has simplified itself to US China is in part because the leading foundation models are US and Chinese. There are some European ones that are making real progress. The application layer is way more diversified in who's doing what and what could be promising. And I think it's also more nascent. Um, the the thing that I'll kind of pivot a little bit and just a point to kind of go back to the last question, but also relating to this is one of the things that I think about as a national security interest for the US that has given us an advantage in AI is our ability to bring smart people to the US, is our capital markets that allow for innovation to flourish and to be funded quickly. These kinds of things are actually really critical. And I think of them as a bucket of like healthy markets and like generally being appealing to talent at the university level and at the corporate level. Those are things I worry a lot about. Not to make it, too partisan, but like what's going on with the current administration on those worry me deeply for what that means for American leadership. Because the fact that all of the AI that we're talking about right now is based on the transformer model. That is a paper that was written by 8 people who were employees of an American company working in America. All eight of them were in California, but 6 of them were immigrants and 2 were children of immigrants. That to me is actually a great sense of pride as an American, but also a national security strength. And so I try to think a lot about what does it mean for us that the next wave of innovation comes from the US, because we should want that. And that's actually what keeps me up at night is China's doing a lot to think about what's the next wave. EU's, they've got Horizon Europe and a few other things to fund research. So how do we think about that context is something that I think a lot about. I don't have thoughts on the free trade agreement provisions. That's beyond my expertise.
I mean, again, I'm also not an expert in this space, but I would plus one what Assad said in regards to sort of the importance of keeping our immigration sort of patterns open enough to like ensure that this competition, as we think about just global competition and also just innovation within the country itself, like who is feeding that and building into that. Yeah, I mean, he put it in really well. We signed a letter with other sort of tech trade associations, kind of calling out the president's, I think, recent proposal or idea of like attaching a $100,000 sort of fee for H-1B visas. But again, we don't work on immigration issues deeply, but this is one area where it's like, as a center left organization, it was a pretty easy, ask for us to jump in.
Thank you. Ilan, did you want to say anything?
Okay, thanks.
Okay, next question. Should the data created and used be considered public or private asset? I'm not sure. Maybe um, Dr. Tripathi what data is she talking about? But maybe you want to give this a try.
Yeah, I feel like that could go in a lot of different directions about if we're talking about like training data or personally identifiable or so I'm not quite sure there. I tend not to think about most personal data in the asset framework. I know some do, um, in part because there's weirdness around data doesn't have a clear ownership and it can be recreated without losing value. So there's a lot of complications in the framework of how to think about it. Generally speaking, yeah, I guess there's a lot there. I won't go into like any subset of that, but
We can come back to that. Hopefully, Dr. Tripathi can clarify. Okay.
Well, I don't
Any
mind
other
just
comments?
maybe just saying one thing on that, Susan, just because
Please.
I think it is quite important in that these models were trained on huge corpuses of books, the entire internet, and now the people who owned that data, there's big court cases over whether they should be paid out, and then there was a big Anthropic settlement where people whose books were trained on by Anthropic had to be paid out, and moreover, at the level of inference, whenever a model answers a question, it has to consume data on the internet, and increasingly, its chatbots might go behind paywalls to get that information in order to answer your query. Um, um, but these models aren't necessarily remunerating the content creators, the websites, whose data they're consuming. And so that's kind of leading to the internet kind of contracting. So I do think that, when we think about what is really fueling this space, besides for VC money, global competition, and the prospects of, these big markets being created, what's fueling it is public data that's not at this stage yet being remunerated, and the potential harms to the internet are enormous, and yet the internet is the basis for for these models content. So really, I think the internet as a market that needs protecting, is probably like a key discussion when we think about harms from a consumer perspective, or even a competition perspective, but more consumer perspective, where this is the market that I think is really kind of being destroyed, which we're kind of struggling with at the moment.
well said.
Agreed. Okay, here's a comment for us. It's about Canada and that there's this call to strengthen Canada's digital sovereignty. And I can tell you, having spent the summer in Canada, it's become a huge issue. But it may be more as a result of the Trump tariffs and other threats to Canada. Okay, so we have a question. A single consumer GPU can run a 30 billion parameter LLM. My understanding is DeepSeek has 600 billion parameters. What I'm suggesting is that full stack AI applications are not limited to big tech. Should competition policy, instead of punishing, create incentives for innovation and data security at the individual consumer level?
So, the couple immediate thoughts that come to mind for me are KJ mentioned the Create AI Act. That's to support something called the National AI Research Resource. I have a lot of love for that because the original NAIR bill is one that I worked on back in the day, and so I think that's a great idea. The premise of it is there is expense in doing kind of original AI research or even development, and so it pools compute and to some extent data as well to be available. It started as researchers, but now it's researchers and startups. That plays to one part of what you're saying of, these models can get really big. I think what the questioner is saying is actually they can get so small that you could run kind of a full stack perspective on your own. GPU or a consumer or anything. I'm not sure quite what that means at the level of like, should we have regulations at the end level? But I do think it means that like calls for transparency or even some of the regulatory structures we have, in my mind, are sometimes incorrectly structured by technical measures like flops or GPUs or anything like that. What we should be thinking about is number of users for impact. Like that's where my mind goes to that question of, yeah, there could be really small models that have a big impact.
I mean, I'll just quickly reiterate. I think for me, there's sort of two kind of elements in the question. When it comes to like just data security, I think, yeah, at the individual consumer level, again, this is where the need for a just comprehensive national comprehensive privacy law. I think data security, how data is used, what transparency means, all that needs to be sort of set apart. In terms of competition policy, I'm not, I don't think the role of competition policy in the United States is to create incentive. I think the role of competition policy is to protect the consumer. And so again, like focusing on the consumer welfare standard, thinking through what harms there looks like. And when we think about remedies, I think again, like I would just reiterate, like that's where I see sort of the role of competition policy in the US.
Okay, thank you. How prepared are we for the moment when an adversary doesn't hack our systems but quietly poisons the training data, shaping the model's behavior until it delivers the outcome they want?
There's some discussion around data poisoning issues, and there has been for years. My part of it is, to Elon's point, we know that most of the large foundation models use something called common crawl and other ways of crawling the open internet. So there's ways of that as one part of the training data set, but there's a bunch of other training data that they're starting to use that we actually have very little insight into what's actually going into them. And so I think there is a need for transparency of even understanding what's the training data set that we're talking about, because we should be worried about an adversary trying to poison training data, but that wouldn't just come from, a bunch of slop on the internet that creates a million web pages. It could come in a number of other ways that are probably easier to target and more sophisticated.
Yeah, I think we would agree with the idea of wanting transparency in terms of training data to the extent that it's not sort of opening up any kind of trade secrets or hurting competition between companies in that sense. I will say again, this is just to beat the same drum over and over again. We saw I would my hypothesis on like when the US really got aggressive on tech regulation was in the wake of the 2016 election. I think post seeing that adversaries were essentially using platforms and using sort of the ability to use personal data to kind of weaponize and create division on on Facebook, now Meta, but Facebook's the same platform. The ability there for adversaries to kind of come in and use that information into so Discord, I think, has continued is a decades-long tradition. And so I do think that again, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not an expert in terms of like like how close we are to this being a reality, but I do think that it is definitely always a threat. And again, the importance of having transparency to a helpful extent in terms of how these platforms or how these companies are using training data, and again, just having personal protection over like consumer data is going to be critical as well.
Okay. Um, I don't see any more questions. Would our speakers and moderators like to make some final comments? Like, where is this going in the United States? Given that, as KJ suggested, we're not aiming at incentives, we're aiming at protecting consumers. And yet we don't have any competition policies, at least from the legislature right now, successfully. We don't have clarity, is what I meant to say.
I'm happy to start. KJ, you unmuted. You want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, why don't you go? Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So this is a good discussion, and I appreciate hearing KJ's perspective. And I've known him for years, and I appreciate the way he thinks on these issues. My view of the goals of competition policy are actually broader than consumer protection. The word consumer doesn't show up in the Sherman Act. It doesn't show up in the Clayton Act. The 100-year-old statutes we do have on antitrust. Um, there is a layer of protecting competition, and the way that shows up for me in today's environment is the role of innovation. If we want to see AI applied in ways that actually has the uses we want and that were promised, right? That the glowing promises that the AI companies make about what the future holds, that's going to require a level of innovation where markets could be a good tool. But you actually have to allow for the kind of competition that isn't just a couple of big companies picking winners and losers. And so that to me is actually a goal of competition policy. To answer your question directly, Susan, I think you're right. There hasn't been an appetite to pass legislation, and we've seen legislation fail in the past. This is an area where that is the kind of statement that's always true when you look at regulatory histories of new industries until it's not, right? So that was true for years and years for railroads until it wasn't. It was true for telecom until it wasn't. Often a crisis is what leads to a regulatory shift, but not always. And so it's not inconceivable to me that you actually start to get some movement here. You may not start at the biggest levels. You may start at something that looks like non-discrimination instead of structural separation. Who knows? But it's actually pretty conceivable to me that the political winds shift because there are elements on the right and left that are actually really excited at the voter and lawmaker level by doing and they find importance in pushing for stronger competition policy.
KJ?
Um, so yeah, I'll just mention, yeah, I've known Assad for quite a long time, and actually, what brought us together were conversations around data privacy protections. When he was on the Hill, and I was at a civil rights organization, we would talk quite a bit about like how do we, build appetite, or how do we move or think strategically about building data governance. And now we've obviously taken different pathways since then, but I think it's always good to have these discussions and to hear his perspective. I mean, Assad is right. Like the word consumer does not show up in our laws. And this is a piece we didn't really talk about here. And I'll be honest, I'm not an expert. And that is that a lot of competition law and exercise has been kind of played out in the courts, right? Consumer welfare standard is established as a legal doctrine. And we saw in the sort of, though there were attempts through Congress, in the last 2, 3 years to kind of pass these massive competition laws, we did see that the DOJ and again, state attorneys general bringing suits against tech companies in terms of, bringing it under their statutes related to competition or antitrust law. I see, in terms of Susan's question about where do we see things going here, take it back to my opening where I laid out I kind of gave you guys a spoiler at the very beginning of what I'd be talking about, and that is, I think Assad is right to sort of ring the alarm bell here in certain parts of the stack, but I do think that new players keep emerging. I do think the global space, again, this is a different sort of conversation than railroads in the US. Like we're talking about a global competitive space where, competition from China, and emerging players from Europe and so on could potentially, change how investors play here and what companies kind of like break ahead. So I think it's important to watch, but the other thing I would say is again, like watch the courts. We'll see how litigation plays out if in terms of how lawyers and different departments of justice across the country bring any kind of litigation forward. But beyond that, no, I think it's an important conversation to have. I do think that while big tech in the past has been a sort of easy target to be like, look, this is where like you guys are benefiting, and they have benefited. I'm never going to like disclaim that. But I do think in this conversation, it's important to see how emerging players come out. It's important to see, we're seeing like companies sort of make deals. And the last final point I'll say is like, I do think the difference here versus other platforms or other competition conversations, let's say like a railroad, where you have one specific need when you get on a train, right? You want to go from point A to point B. You're using the railroads, and if those are monopolized, then you have an issue. With the AI sort of foundation model space, again, you're seeing that there's different needs. There's even different approaches, right? Anthropic trains their models on a constitutional principle. OpenAI doesn't, uses a different sort of model. We see Meta and other groups focusing on open weighted models, whereas there's, other companies are using a closed model approach. And so again, like I do think that we can look at the top line the market, the sort of like what the profits folks are making, but I think looking deeper into how these companies are playing out, what they're offering consumers is also critical to be part of the conversation. So thank you for hosting us. This was a great conversation.
Lon, do you want to make some summary comments or final comments?
Just to say, I actually think, I find myself agreeing with both of our distinguished guests, and I find that there's been a lot of common ground, especially when it comes to issues of data and data rights, which for me opens up the question of, visibility into what's happening on these platforms, which are managed by algorithms and on these models. And yeah, given all this commonality, I wonder, why has nothing necessarily been done? And we do see the courts, obviously, there's been a number of court cases now about the Google and Apple's App Store and Google's ownership, vertical integrated ownership of the advertising stack. So in some ways, the courts are kind of catching up. But I still wonder, if we're agreeing on some of these core issues, why is there no progress being done? And I do think it comes back to this question of infrastructure and competition. And as companies get larger and larger, because the technological requirements of what it takes to compete gets bigger and bigger, we're kind of left with this conundrum of, well, it's not quite infrastructure because, as KJ notes, this isn't really the railroads. These are like dynamic new technologies. They're often consumer facing and producer facing, which you could argue the railroads were too, but these are not commodities. You can't just say, oh, we're going to have simple pricing by carriages and a non-discrimination law. But then the question is, well, then what is the appropriate regulation for such a large dynamic industry? And my sense and the stuff I'm working on is to say, well, you maybe have to embed the regulations into the code itself, because it's quite complicated for the courts to regulate. But what happens if, we had visibility and regulation built into the code? And that's what the early internet was, because the regulations are built into the code of the internet through open protocols, which mandated things like interoperability. So it wasn't up to Gmail, whether Gmail, necessarily allowed sending mail to Yahoo. It was built into the actual protocols of the internet and the web. So I do wonder, in the future, how we can kind of merge that approach with the competition approach. But no, either way, it's been a great discussion, and I hope the debate will continue.
Thank you so much. And apologies to the people who somehow didn't get the link. We're not sure what happened because from our vision, the link is embedded in the invite, but okay. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate it. Please join me in thanking our speaker and moderator, and we'll see you all for our next webinar. Thank you so much. Have a great Thanksgiving.